Welcome back to Gold Derby. I'm Christopher Rosen. I'm joined by Alena Smith, the creator and writer and showrunner and everything of Dickinson, season 2 of which is on Apple TV Plus right now. Alena, I want to start there. I guess, what did for going into season 2 after the success of season 1? Like, what was your hopes and how did you approach the show and how you wanted to expand it?
Yeah, well, we had a sort of unconventional chronology of the creation of this show, because actually all of season 2 was written and went into production before season 1 actually aired. So I think that was in some ways a huge privilege that we got to make season 2 sort of as independently as we had made season 1. And really, in some sense, they are one continuous sort of creative impulse guiding both seasons. Even though the 2 seasons are quite different from each other in terms of theme and even in certain ways tone, I think season 2 is more, it's a little darker, it's a little more mature, and some of that just has to do with the themes that we've taken on to explore. So whereas in the first season, Emily is really this kind of rebellious, rambunctious, sort of just post-adolescent young writer who is still struggling to assert herself in the face of her parents and their expectations about who she's going to be and how she's going to behave. In season 2, she's kind of come to terms with her parents, but is now attempting to step out into the wider world and the wider sort of spotlight of society as a more adult writer who has her own voice, but isn't quite sure how to use it, or whether or not she wants to seek attention for the work that she is creating. And she finds herself in a kind of psychological thriller of sorts around fame and ambition and what it means in particular to be a woman seeking a life in the public eye.
Yeah, all of that is great. One of the things I really loved about it, what you mentioned, the theme of fame, but I thought one of the things that I really liked about it, it's so interesting, is not just the celebrity aspect of fame, but what you do with your platform, right? And how are you, your responsibility as someone who is given and afforded the platform, what are you doing? And I think having Emily and juxtaposing that with Henry and stuff is a really interesting thing. Can you talk a little about the discussions around that and how, you said, you kind of did all this maybe season 1 and season 2 before season 1 even aired, right? Writing it, I guess. Can you talk about building that in and building that tension in of how you think of your platform, basically?
Well, I do think that this season absolutely is a sort of response to what it's like today to live our lives on these online spaces. And everybody, not just celebrities, everybody has to be making choices every day about what do we put out there and what do we keep to ourselves. And also about sort of the attention economy and the power structures embedded in, who gets visibility versus who doesn't. And that's certainly at play in the story of Emily and Henry, where Henry, who is the Dickinson's groundskeeper, has started running a secret underground abolitionist newspaper out of the Dickinson's barn, with meetings late at night, and everything they publish anonymously because they literally are afraid for their lives if it gets traced to them. And so those, Henry is a person who doesn't even have the option of being seen for his work, and is obviously writing for a reason that isn't just for the sake of being seen, but rather perhaps to try and change the world or organize people. And I think that but that at the same time, that doesn't mean that he himself or the people who write for his journal aren't also wishing that they could be seen, because any writer, any artist, wants, in some sense, is writing for an audience, right? So it's a lot of these kind of looking at intersections of privilege and visibility, and what's I think important to say is that it's feels very relevant to now, and that is the intention, but it's all completely based in fact and historical detail about the kinds of things that people were doing then. And in fact, in some ways, the birth of print media and celebrity culture can really be traced to this time in the 1850s when Dickinson was alive, and especially in New England, which was just like a hotbed of writing and publishing. So
yeah, you do that a lot too with Sam Bowles' character, and like he's very much like maybe like clickbait journalism. I don't even know what you would call it, right? Like that's what it is.
BuzzFeed of his time, yeah.
Yes, right. And it's like very it's just fascinating. And like you said, like I think it's so interesting to like find those themes, and like so they're so apparently connected to today. You don't even have to like stretch that much, I guess. And for you, I'm sure that, and the writers, I'm sure that's like is that something that you kind of like, as you're peeling back the onion layers, is that like so obvious, or is that like something you're like excited to find, but like it's like, oh, it is so relevant to now?
I mean, I think that I chose these themes because they are so relevant to now, and also they are so relevant to Dickinson and to the sort of central paradox or irony of her life, which is that she wrote, nearly 2,000 poems, one of the greatest bodies of work ever created on American soil, but almost none of it was ever published or recognized while she lived. And which is the plight of she's sort of an exaggerated case, but it's certainly a familiar story about female artists and any type of marginalized person who doesn't get recognized in their own time. And so I in writing this show, my goal is always to be uncannily blurring the lines between the past and the present, using the past as a way to look at the present, as a kind of like filter for the present. And the hope is to show not only sort of how similar the past might have been in certain ways. I think much more importantly, it's to show how the present is still conditioned by the same forces as the past.
Right. Back the other thing I wanted to ask about Sam character too is I found his relationship with Emily so it's just really fascinating. And one of the things I appreciate about it is that like I felt like the end heartbreak that she ends up feeling is much more about like how he presents himself as this feminist and like a real ally to her, and then is like shown not to be that, and her innocence on that is like really broken. And I found that like really interesting, and definitely another like modern thing like that I think has become more and more apparent is like young women in the workforce like kind of like being sandbagged by their older male mentors, let's say, or whatever it is, right? Like I think we've seen that over and over again, but not necessarily something I've seen depicted on the show. And I thought that was really interesting, and I'd love for you to talk about like their relationships and how you kind of like put that out, because it's like really good.
Sam Bowles sees himself as a progressive, and in many ways he is a progressive. He is interested, much, unlike Emily's father, who was just dead set against women publishing. Sam Bowles is all for it and is in fact going around New England looking for like the hot new female voices to put in his newspaper. And he's also accelerating the pace of news and kind of bringing everything into modernity in a sense. But I guess the breakdown occurs when the actual sort of power structure at the core of their relationship potentially gets threatened. And, it's all well and good for Sam to maintain his position of the gatekeeper, the editor, the power center who can say, I anoint you or I don't. But he's still the one kind of guiding the attention and getting to say, like, here's where you get on the bus and here's where you get off. He's not willing to like hand over the keys to the bus, So it's complicated, but I really try to write characters, including my main character, Emily, who are not all good or all bad, and that there's lots of shading and complexity to what they're doing. And there's a lot of reasons for Emily to be attracted to a guy like Sam and vice versa. It's also, of course, super complicated by the fact that Emily, who is in love with Sue, finds that Sue in this season has sort of retreated into a persona, kind of like an influencer online who has disappeared behind the posts, and when Emily loses that real authentic connection with Sue, who's always been the source of her true, honest feedback as a writer, it's not surprising that she could kind of fall into the clutches of someone like Sam, who seems to be providing that, a version of that kind of appreciation and love.
Yeah. I would love to. So you kind of, like you mentioned, like Sue and Emily's relationship is pretty fraught, I would guess, or whatever. For most of the season, you kind of like, obviously, spoiler alert, but the show isn't on, and we're talking about this. They end up like the last scene of they're kind of like together again at the end, and I just love that scene. I thought the way you like their last scene is great, and like the way it's shot is so cool, and the music selection, all these different things. Can you talk a little about like the inspirations for that, or like what you were thinking there? Like I just like it's like the overhead shot of them, and like I love that. I think it's sweet spirit song at the end. It's so good, and it's like I'm just like obsessed with it. So like I'd love to hear you talk about it.
So it's funny, I guess, because you love it, I'll tell you something that I haven't said before about it, which is that of course, like, this is a queer relationship and these two young women are in love, and it's great that this kind of representation is happening, right? But there's another metaphoric level to me that is about Emily and Sue, which is about the relationship between a writer and her reader, and that I believe Emily Dickinson came to the conclusion in poems like "The soul selects her own society," or "If I can stop one heart from breaking, I shall not live in vain." I believe Emily came to a conclusion that other writers have come to as well, which is, I can't think about the whole world when I write. I have to think about one person who needs to know what I'm saying, and one person who will understand what I'm saying. And this sort of idealized love affair that can occur between a writer and a reader. And I think that what that last scene is both the consummation of these two, girlfriends, but it's also that more literary consummation of what every poet hopes for, which is being understood. So yeah, that's kind of how I saw it too.
That's really cool. You mentioned like you mentioned like all her poems, thousands of poems, I guess, and obviously like each of the episodes, you're taking titles and stuff. From a bigger picture standpoint, like how are you picking some of these? Are you like trying to pick like very deep cuts and like stuff that's totally like far into maybe the viewer to get them more involved, maybe on another level, and like looking at Emily Dickinson as her career? Or are you kind of like how do you balance that out, I guess, for like what you're kind of like building?
I guess it can really happen in a number of different ways, because it certainly can happen that I look at a poem and I just think that's such a cool poem, we have to use it. It can also happen that, sort of relatedly, that like there's a poem that suggests an action that's so visual and so dramatic that I want to stage it as an episode. But it can also happen that we're just creating an episode and then we have to work backwards and sort of go to the online searchable digital Dickinson archive and put in, the word, funeral, and find out how many, if there's this, if there's an episode about a funeral, which there's many, because people are always dying in Dickinson, and so yeah, I mean, it can happen in a lot of different ways, and it's certainly not like each episode shows Emily creating the poem that episode is called. And in fact, in season 2, I sort of realized, looking back on it, that because this is a season where Emily gets writer's block, as soon as she chooses to step into the spotlight, she's kind of cut off from her own authentic voice. There's actually a number of episodes where we don't really see Emily writing because her creative force has been stopped. And, I think that the audience on some level feels that and misses those beautiful words that are her poems. And so it's a relief when like it starts flowing again.
Yeah, the other thing to season 2 obviously is like I think I read another interview you did where you mentioned like at the end that there's the John Brown raid happens, and like it's kind of like maybe like I think you called it like the 9/11 moment for the characters, and like watching the whole season, it was interesting you said, because it's like you're just watching them and like knowing the history obviously of like the Civil War and what's coming. It's an interesting tension that you have there for the viewer already, right? Because you're like, oh, like there's whole world is going to change like in the next few years or next year or whatever it is. Can you talk a little about that and like building that in, and then like in pivoting then to season? No need to like spoil season 3, obviously, but like anyway, like leading those breadcrumbs basically, and like leading into season 3. I just thought that was like, it does add like a dark, like you mentioned, like the season is darker, but it does add like, it's just like the tension behind, you're like just always like it's always there, but not like you're not hitting it over the head. I found that.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, and like it's funny because season 2 is darker than season 1, but it's also a lot more glamorous. And like because they're just having parties and going to the opera and going to the spa. And you know, when we get into season 3 and the Civil War is underway, like no more parties, and like everyone is dressed in black. So in some ways, maybe season 3 is even darker, but it's not. I mean, there's also ways in which season 3 is really a return to the kind of like warmth and embrace of the family, because, you know, I mean, the unexpected thing for us was that we didn't know that we would be writing season 3 over Zoom in a pandemic. And, you know, I think that this sense of the nation really going through a trauma and processing a lot of grief, but also that, you know, being stuck at home with your family, which is how Emily Dickinson spent her entire life, because, you know, we know she famously didn't really leave her childhood home. So, you know, I actually think that in some ways for Emily, stepping away from her family feels scarier, and when she gets to go home to that, it actually feels a little brighter. So but even in the midst of all of the difficulty and darkness of war. So yeah, but that's all to come in season 3, which we're in production now, and it's very exciting. And I love the fact that, you know, with this show about a poet and her family, that we can kind of come back each season and see new sides of these characters. And in some ways, Hailee as Emily, like, I mean, she's really coming of age in the show. So she's really growing and maturing between each season and struggling with new thematic conflicts. Like, she's definitely not worried about fame anymore in season 3. So
right. That's you mentioned Hailee too. I mean, like I said, I think she's so great in the show because, like, obviously, like, you know, the show is like got comic elements, and obviously, like we were talking about, like a lot of drama, and I feel like she definitely is able to mix those, you know, like maybe like just like the more lighthearted stuff with that kind of drama as a writer. And is that knowing that she's able to execute that stuff, is that just like such a weight off your shoulders, you know, you can kind of write anything basically for her, as Emily.
Absolutely. And I think that, you know, like the connection there is that it's like with Hailee, it always feels truthful. You know, and that's what makes her such a great actor, is that she takes the work really seriously, and she's not really making distinctions between comedy and drama. And in some ways, like, neither do I. Like, I think that it's about really being present with this character in any given moment, whether that one is totally absurd or totally erotic, or, you know, it kind of like can go anywhere. And what I appreciate about Hailee is that she really holds everyone's feet to the fire about, like, are we telling the truth? You know, and yeah. I think that her performance is so rich as a result of that.
And then the last thing, and thank you again for this time. I guess, like, you know, the response I think for the show has been really strong, and I think especially for like young women watching, like, it does feel like it's really struck a chord with young women. And I guess, can you talk about like how, like, that response and like how gratifying that is? I guess, not to sound like overly sappy, but I'm imagining
it's so gratifying. And it's you know, I remember the passion that I felt about a show like, oh, sorry about this, Mike.
It's okay. It looks beautiful. The lighting. That's great.
That, you know, like, I remember my passion for like My So-Called Life, for example, and how seen that made me feel when I was 14. And you know, and I think that Dickinson is a show that's not just for teenagers, or not even mostly for teenagers. I think it's really for people in their 20s and 30s, or, you know, maybe there's a lot of different ways in. But you know, I think that, like, if I was in my 20s, this is the show I would have wanted to see. You know, the fact that you get to have the beautiful period dresses, but also like the best soundtrack, and you know, Wiz Khalifa playing Death is always great, and our amazing like celebrity cameos. We just, but that it is like grounded in the serious questions about like how to be a female artist in America today, and how different is it or not from what it was like to be in Emily Dickinson's time. And so I love that people are seeing themselves in the show, passionately caring about the characters. And it's so wonderful because at this point now the show is out there and it is a kind of conversation and dialogue between the world and us. So that's really nice.
Yeah, it's great. Can't wait for season 3. Alena Smith, thank you so much for doing this. Appreciate it.
Nice
Dickinson, nice talking to you. Dickinson season 2 is on Apple TV Plus now. Thank you.
Thank you.